There are worlds in this galaxy that burn slowly, as if reluctant to forget their histories. Their ruins glow not with fire, but with memory. Among them floats Prospero, broken, beautiful, and dead. The dust of 1,000 years still clings to its shattered spires, whispering names no longer spoken. The air, though long since vanished to the void, hums with echoes of a forgotten tongue. A symphony of minds once sang here in unity. So, before we begin this dark journey together, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into the Star Wars lore. I noticed that about 98.5% of you watching are not subscribe button, and hitting that subscribe button really helps the channel grow and lets me bring you more of these epic tales if you're hungry for even more Star Wars lore and want to explore other corners of this waste galaxy. Definitely check out my channel. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time is it there. There's something magical about knowing we're all connected across different time zones, sharing these stories together under the same stars. Now get comfortable. Dim those lights, maybe turn on your fan for that gentle background sound. Wrap yourself in your blanket and let's journey into the shadows of Thew Old Republic together. Now, silence reigns. The stars around it flicker like candles at the edge of dying breath. Some say it is haunted, not by spirits, but by a dream too bright for the age into which it was born. A dream of knowledge, of order, of peace. That dream wore red, bore a single cyclopean eye, and dared to look into the future uninvited. And in looking, it was cursed. This is not a tale of glory. It is not even truly a tale of war. It is a story of tragedy, the slow unraveling of hope, the fragile beauty of ambition crushed beneath the weight of destiny. It is the story of a father who built a prison of silence, a son who shattered it with a scream, and a legion that paid the price for dreaming too deeply. We tell this story because we love you. Truly. You who have wandered into this place of lost empires and broken oaths. You matter. Your thoughts, your presence, they are part of this great tapestry. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. In the far reaches of the Segmentum Solar, before Prospero fell, it rose. Its towers glistened like polished crystal, spiraling into the golden atmosphere with impossible elegance. Tisca, the city of light, stood untouched by time, nestled between the shimmering seas of Achaemenid and the amber cliffs of the Nephrin wastes. There, beneath those towers, lived a people who dared to think, not merely to survive, but to understand. They were guided by a single, mighty hand. Magnus, the Red the Cyclops, the Crimson King, a Primarch, born not of mortal womb, but of divine experimentation. He fell from the heavens in fire and visions, an orphan of the warp cast into the world with no guidance but instinct. And yet, where others descended into madness, he built, he learned, he taught. Even in his youth, the people of Prospero knelt before his brilliance, not out of fear, but awe. He gave them purpose, he gave them sight. And yet, even in those early days, he felt it, the pull, the distortion, the eye watching behind every mirror, the future twisting and coiling like a serpent, always just out of reach. For every vision he had, there was a shadow. For every truth uncovered, a deeper mystery that clawed at the edge of comprehension. He would tame it, he told himself. He would bend the warp to his will, as he had bent stone and steel, mines and cities. Knowledge was not meant to be feared. It was meant to be wielded. And for a time, it worked. In the present moment, as his Mind flickers through ancient memories. Magnus stands in the hollow library at the heart of Tisca. He does not move. He does not breathe. Around him, thousands of tomes hover in stasis. Scrolls from dead Xenos cultures, human treatises lost to old night, whispered philosophies encoded in the tongues of the Eldar, the Krork, even the Necrontyr, all held within a labyrinth of perfect silence. But his thoughts are not here. They are in the storm beyond the veil. He senses a ripple, a thread snapping in the webway, something vast and angry, something betrayed, the Emperor. For weeks now, Magnus has dreamed in fire. He has seen Horus fall beneath the weight of a cursed blade. He has seen the War Master rise, not as a hero of unity, but as the architect of the Imperium's doom. He has seen Terra burn, and the throne, once radiant, soaked in ash and ichor. He cannot allow it. But the edict remains. No sorcery, no warp sight, no intervention. The Emperor had made it clear. His chosen sons were to obey. Magnus had obeyed for too long. The cost of silence was too great. His heart fractures. The Crimson King steps into the inner sanctum. Here, a mirror waits. It is no ordinary construct of glass and silver. It is woven of psychic matter, bound with the threads of unreality, etched with runes only he can see. He gazes into it, and it gazes back. Not his reflection, but 1,000 possible selves. A man weeping on a ruined tower, a god enthroned in a palace of flame, a monster howling beneath a broken moon. Each version of him bears the same wound, the price of knowledge. He reaches forward. Elsewhere, the Legion stirs. The 1,000 sons, his loyal sons, each touched by psychic flame, sense their father's unease. Ahriman, chief librarian, walks the galleries of the Corvidae and senses the pull of fate wrapping tight around them. He speaks to no one. He merely watches the horizon. It is a crimson dusk, always crimson in this place. The scream, when it comes, is not heard by ears. It is a thought pushed into the marrow of reality, a psychic howl that tears through the fabric of the webway and crashes against the walls of terror. It shatters wards, burns through defenses, scars the vaults beneath the golden throne. And for a moment, the Emperor opens his eyes. Magnus falls to his knees. Blood, real blood, drips from his mouth, from his eye, from his palms. He has broken something sacred. The bond between father and son is severed. But he has done what he must. He has warned them. He has saved them. Hasn't he? On Terra, the custodians scramble. Malkador, the sigillite, stands still, unmoving, his expression unreadable. The Emperor rises from the throne not in rage, but in sorrow. He knew this day would come. He knew which of his sons would reach too far. But knowing did not make it easier. Back on Prospero, the air is still. But something has shifted. The wind carries the scent of ash. The light bends strangely at the edge of the city. And, somewhere beneath the world, deep in the vaults even Magnus dared not open, something ancient stirs. Tzeentch smiles. The stakes have been set. The board is ready. And the dream that was Prospero begins to die. Prospero did not sleep. Even in the stillness after the psychic scream, after Magnus shattered the veil between reality and madness, the city of light pulsed with invisible tension. It was as though the very stone beneath their feet remembered what had been done, and recoiled in quiet grief. The towers still gleamed, the sea still shimmered with phosphorescent calm, but every glance out toward the horizon felt watched. The 1,000 sons, once serene in their scholarly duties, now moved like men under siege, and in a way, they were. Ahriman stood atop one of Tisca's spiraling observatories, his arms folded behind his back, his mind adrift through webs of fate. The stars above swirled with subtle distortions, warp currents lapping against the edges of reality. His psychic senses could taste it. The Emperor's wrath had been stirred. He did not need to ask why. He knew what Magnus had done. He had felt it, not merely the scream, though that had pierced every psyche like a dagger, but the intention behind it. It had not been an act of war, but of desperation, of love perhaps, twisted by fear. Magnus had broken his oath to save what he could, but the warp was not a tool one touched lightly. Even now, the consequences slithered through their world like roots in the foundation. Ahriman closed his eyes, breathing deeply. Beneath the surface of his soul, something coiled, a knot of regret, of anger, of guilt. For years now, he had watched his brothers change. What began as fleeting moments, voices whispering in the dead of night, sudden tremors of the hand, blood clots where none should be, had grown into terrifying transformations. Warriors once proud and brilliant now degenerated into mewling beasts, bodies writhing under the strain of uncontrollable mutation. The flesh change, a curse no knowledge had yet unravelled. Ahriman had studied tirelessly, searching through the deepest archives, consulting the darkest codices. He had begged Magnus to seek help from Terra, to request aid, or at least answers. But Magnus had refused, not because he lacked love for his sons, because he feared what the Emperor would say, because he feared being right. In the lower quarters of the Corvidae chamber, Brother Faeltor recited the rites of stillness. His voice was a whisper over the red-lit runes, his fingers trembling slightly as he traced sigils in the air. Across from him, Brother Menek rested against a wall, silent, pale. There was something wrong with Menek's eyes. They did not move. They did not blink. Fael tried not to stare, tried not to see the jagged bone forming beneath the skin of Menek's jaw, or the way his voice had become too deep, too wide, as if something else spoke with him. "You must tell Ahriman," Fael whispered. Menek merely nodded, though it was unclear if he had heard, or if anything human remained inside him. Magnus sat alone in the Athenaeum Noctis, a vault of silver stone and shifting light. Books turned their own pages here. Statues spoke in half-dreams. Thought forms drifted lazily through the air like jellyfish across the sea. But Magnus heard none of it. His mind was inward. His scream had reached Terra. He knew this not because of divination or feedback, but because he felt the Emperor recoil, not in rage, but pain. That pain echoed now in Magnus's heart like a wound that would not close. He remembered his father's voice, deep and calm, an ocean at dusk. "You are my son, Magnus, but there are paths even you must not walk." And he had walked them. He had to. He had seen Horus turn, had seen the death of the dream. If none else would act, then he must. And yet, the result had been catastrophe. Webway gates collapsing, the Imperial Palace wounded, and now silence from Terra. He feared what that silence meant. He feared who might be sent. Ahriman entered without knocking. Magnus did not lift his gaze. "You felt it," Ahriman said. "Yes," Magnus replied softly. "The change is worsening." "I know. They need a cure." Magnus finally looked up. His eye, gleaming, terrible, held centuries of sorrow in its depths. "I have tried, Azek. Every path I walk leads only to further ruin. The rubric, the prescription, the truth behind the flesh change. It is beyond our reach." "Beyond mine," Ahriman frowned. "Then we must go further." A long silence passed. Magnus studied his son, Azek Ahriman, the unbroken tower, the quiet storm. Brilliant, loyal, dangerous. There was love between them, but also fear. For Ahriman's mind, though sharp as obsidian, had edges even Magnus could not fully control. Further, Magnus said, "You mean deeper into the warp, into the arms of what lies beyond?" "I mean," Ahriman replied, "that we are already drowning. Better to swim forward than wait to sink." Magnus smiled faintly. "Is that wisdom?" he asked, "or desperation?" "It is survival," Ahriman said, "and perhaps redemption." Elsewhere in the pyramid of Photep, rituals continued. Librarians meditated in great circles, weaving stabilities into the ether, attempting to bind the madness growing in their flesh. Apothecaries dissected bodies twisted beyond recognition, scribbling notes with trembling hands. No answers came. Some simply vanished. Others burst into fire, screaming names that did not belong to them. And still, the city shone. That night Prospero dreamed. It dreamed of a white wolf on a field of red snow, of fire consuming glass towers, of a voice, cold, furious, shouting a name with terrible finality: Magnus. Ahriman stood once again on the observatory as the stars churned. He reached out with his mind, seeking fate lines, possibilities, futures unwritten. But the threads had begun to knot. The skein of destiny was folding inward. Something was coming, and it came not with warning, but with silence. Below, Magnus sat in his sanctum and reached once more toward the mirror. This time it showed him not a reflection, but a memory. The first time he had opened his mind to the warp, as a child lost in a desert storm. The voices had sung to him then, not with malice, but with sorrow. They had shown him pain, yes, but also potential. He had believed even then that he could save them all. He still believed it, but belief, he knew now, was not enough. In the final hour of the night, a tremor passed through the pyramid's foundations, barely perceptible, like a heartbeat skipped. It was not an earthquake, it was a warning. On Fenris, Leman Russ sharpened his axe. On Terra, the Emperor turned away from the light, and above Prospero, the warp smiled. The first knife had been thrown. The second would follow soon. There are acts so great, so violent in scope, that they echo backward through time, leaving ripples not just in the present, but in memory. Magnus's cry, hurled into the warp like a spear of desperation, did not vanish. It rippled through webway gates. It shattered wards laid by ancients long dead, and it struck the very heart of the Golden Throne. The Emperor felt it, like betrayal burning behind his ribs. He did not rise. He did not rage. He simply closed his eyes, and the throne flickered. On Prospero, Magnus felt the consequences instantly. His body remained still within the sanctum, but his mind was thrust into the current, tossed across unreality and pulled into visions both future and past. He saw Terra burning, not in metaphor, but in ruin. The skies cracked with orbital bombardment. Great cathedrals crumbled. The Astronomican's light flared and guttered like a dying star. But this was not the work of Xenos. This was betrayal, internal, brother against brother, sons against father. In the dream, Horus stood at the gates of the imperial palace, the corpse of Sanguinius at his feet. The War Master's eyes were black voids, and from his open hand spilled the blood of an age. And behind Horus, Magnus saw himself, but not as he was, a shadow of fire, a creature no longer man nor Primarch. He recoiled, tearing himself back into his own flesh, gasping. The warp did not lie, but neither did it tell the truth. It merely reflected, twisted, made metaphors of warnings. Still, the message had been clear. The future was dying. On Terra, alarm screamed in tones never meant to be heard by mortal ears. The emperor's psychic scream of pain and warning surged down the spires of the palace, awakening all within. In the secretive chambers of the sigillite, Malcador stared at a burning scroll. Its ink had dissolved into red mist, symbols unspooling into smoke. "Prospero," he whispered. The emperor, seated once more upon his throne, sent no words to his old friend. None were needed. The decision had already been made. In the frozen halls of the Fang, on the death world of Fenris, the Wolf King received his orders. Leman Russ, Lord of the Space Wolves, did not question. He never questioned. But in the flicker of his gold-rimmed eyes, there was hesitation. Prospero, the city of knowledge, the kingdom of Magnus. Russ remembered the boy who once walked beside him in the early days of the crusade, book in hand, quiet and too thoughtful. He had distrusted him, yes, but had also respected him. Magnus had saved lives on countless worlds, had stopped wars with a word, had always meant well. But Russ also remembered Nicaea. The council had been clear. Sorcery was forbidden, the edict absolute, and Magnus had shattered it. Still, he paused. He sent a message to Malcador. "Is this to be punishment?" he asked, "or execution?" The reply was short. "Bring him to Terra, alive if possible." But in those words, Russ heard the truth. "Kill him if you must." He stood in silence, alone in the cold, as Fenris's wind howled across the ice. Then he turned and began to gather his legion. The Vulca Fenrica would march. On Prospero, the Thousand Suns prepared for something they could not name. In the chambers of the Pavoni, psychers collapsed in convulsions. Their minds were filled with broken visions. Wolves in flame, a great maw devouring the stars, a ship of gold descending like a falling hammer. In the Rehati circle, Ahriman traced runes over a scroll that bled ink of its own accord. The skein had tightened. Fate itself seemed to narrow to a single point, coming swiftly like an arrow loosed from a bow. He found Magnus in meditation, surrounded by thought forms whispering in tongues not heard since the fall of the Eldari. "Something is coming," Ahriman said. Magnus did not open his eye. "I know," he replied. "Should we prepare the legion?" "I have already prepared them. We need more than preparation." Now Magnus opened his eye. "We need penance." Ahriman frowned. "Penance will not shield us." "No," Magnus said quietly, "but perhaps it will buy us time." Far across the stars, in the depths of space, the wolves sailed. Their ships were massive things of ceramite and ice steel, shaped like predators. In silence, they crossed the void, their weapons charged, their warriors grim. Each one had been briefed. Prospero had betrayed the emperor. Magnus had disobeyed the edict. The city of sorcerers must fall. And yet, even among the wolves, there was unease. They had fought with the Thousand Suns before. Not every wolf bore hatred. Some, like Bjorn the Fell-Handed, remembered the day Tiska had saved an entire imperial regiment from annihilation by simply speaking the language of their lost ancestors. But duty bound them now, and duty did not waver. Back on Prospero, the first signs appeared. The warp storms began to bend toward the world, subtle at first, but unmistakable to those who listened. Portents twisted the air. Birds flew in, spirals until their wings bled. Machines whispered in binary that was not their own. And then the sky changed. No alarm sounded. No engines roared. But the people of Tiska looked upward and saw them. Specks in the crimson horizon, growing larger, shadowing the sun. The fleet had arrived. In the chambers of the pyramid, Ahriman stood before Magnus once more. "They are here," he said. Magnus did not speak for a long time. Then, in a voice soft as dust, he said, "I will not fight them." "What?" "I will not raise my hand against my brother. I warned our father. I broke his law. This is what must come." Ahriman was silent, stunned. "They will destroy us," he said. "I know." "You would let your sons die?" Magnus closed his eye. "They die either way." Outside, the 1,000 sons gathered. The city began evacuation protocols. Children, scholars, non-combatants. But there was little time. The fleet moved fast, faster than any diplomatic envoy would. There would be no negotiation. The space wolves came not to speak. They came to burn. In the Tower of the Blind, a child psyker whispered a single word before vanishing into flame. "Russ." And in the warp, something ancient stirred. The chaos god of change, he who schemes, who had long watched Magnus's slow descent into pride and sorrow, leaned forward with inhuman amusement. All threads were in place, all pieces aligned. The dream was unraveling, thread by shimmering thread, and Prospero had begun to bleed. In the vaulted hush of Prospero's libraries, Magnus the Red dreamed of unity, of a future shaped not by chains, but by knowledge. Beneath the luminous domes of Tizca, where psychic flame danced across obsidian walls, the scholars and warriors of the 1,000 Sons walked a path unlike any others in the Emperor's service. They were not merely Astartes, they were philosopher warriors, souls split between the sword and the scroll, between fury and contemplation. It was in this duality that Prospero's tragedy was seeded. For every lesson Magnus instilled in his sons, to question, to seek, to expand, there bloomed a thorn of defiance, not against their father, but against ignorance, against stagnation. The librarius of the Imperium, though now shunned, was once born of Magnus's ambition, to raise the psychic arts to the same heights as the physical, and to integrate them into the Imperium's living structure. And for a time, the Emperor indulged him. It is whispered among the oldest navigators and most secretive Ordo Chronos scholars that it was during the first years of the Great Crusade that Magnus created the Book of the 1,000 Sons, a tome not bound by vellum and ink, but encoded within the warp itself. Its pages were minds, its margins memories, and its ink the very warp stuff of the Sea of Souls. A living book, ever expanding, filled with the lore of dead worlds, and with the names of every psyker saved from the black ships by his hidden hand. For Magnus loved mankind, and so did his sons. Not in the brittle, dogmatic way the word-bearers pretended, nor in the blood-forged way of the wolves or angels, but in a measured, eternal way. They believed in what humanity could become, should it master the invisible forces that surrounded it, if it dared. Azek Ahriman, once Magnus's most devoted son and chief librarian, exemplified this sacred defiance. Where others saw the warp as fire to be feared, he saw it as a language to be spoken with reverence. He and his fellow scholars sought to give form to chaos, to craft order from disorder, not with chains, but with understanding. Through ritual, meditation, and long study, they did what few dared. They made meaning from madness. The Librarius was the dream, an arm of the Legions Astartes, where psychers could be cultivated rather than culled, where the Emperor's children could study the arcane in the light of reason. It was Magnus who founded it. It was Magnus who taught the first of its adepts, and it was Magnus who watched in silence and pain as it was dismantled under the Edict of Nicaea. Before that fateful day, the 1,000 Sons had earned their renown not only through psychic might, but through precise military victories and cultural stewardship. They brought not just conquest, but renaissance. Entire systems left behind their old tyrannies and rose into enlightenment. Their arrival was marked by silence, not the silence of fear, but of awe. Planets where poetry was banned now hummed with song. Worlds where knowledge was chained now burst into symposia. The sons of Prospero brought light, and in doing so, they drew envy. But not all legions understood. Not all Primarchs trusted the flame that danced within the eye sockets of 1,000 sun. Russ scoffed at sorcery, calling it cowardice dressed in mystery. Dawn distrusted anything that could not be measured in steel or concrete. The Lion watched but did not speak, while Lorga, twisting the warp for darker worship, saw in Magnus a rival, not a brother. Yet Magnus did not break faith. He remained the scholar, ever loyal. Even as whispers grew that his arts were too dangerous, that his powers too unpredictable, Magnus sought only to serve. He believed, naively perhaps, that understanding would bridge the gap, that reason would prevail. He sent emissaries to Terra, not spies, but messengers, scribes bearing gifts, writings in 1,000 languages, revealing truths hidden since the age of strife. He offered knowledge freely, asking only that it be received without prejudice. But even the walls of the imperial palace have ears, and they turned inward in suspicion. And so, the Edict of Nicaea came. It is here, in this moment, that the dream began to fracture. The convocation at Nicaea was held in a cathedral so vast it could house titans, built on a world whose name is forgotten, but whose significance remains like a scar upon the galaxy. Every legion sent representatives. Every corner of the Imperium watched, and Magnus stood at its heart, not as a conqueror, but as a defendant. What argument can a soul make when accused of sorcery by those who do not know the difference between wisdom and witchcraft? Magnus spoke with passion, with sorrow, with the clarity of a being who had seen too far ahead. He warned of dangers, yes, but also of promises. He begged not for power, but for permission to continue guiding humanity into a deeper truth. And for a moment, it seemed he had turned the tide. But then came the wolves. Leman Russ, mouth flecked with the fury of old grudges, dismissed every word. Words, he barked, are the tools of liars. Fire is fire. It burns. It kills. It devours. Malcador, the Emperor's shadow, said little, but it was enough. And the Emperor, ever distant, did not look at Magnus as he delivered his judgment. No more witches, he said. No more sorcery. No more warp-born arrogance. The Librarius was dissolved. Psychers were silenced, and the 1,000 Suns were ordered to cease all practices of the arcane. Magnus, in grief, obeyed, but the fire was already lit, and once lit, fire does not unburn. What came next was not rebellion, but warning. Magnus, ever loyal, foresaw disaster. He had glimpsed the future in dreams that bled into waking. He saw betrayal coming, not from him, but from within the Imperium itself. And so, in desperation, he reached out to the Emperor, breaking the edict, not in defiance, but in love. A psychic warning hurled across the warp like a flare into the night. But the warp is no empty sea. It is a realm of echoes and monsters, and the scream that left Magnus's soul did not arrive untouched. The Golden Throne cracked. The Webway project was shattered. The Emperor fell into silence, and terror turned its eyes to Prospero. In those final days before the fall, the 1,000 Suns did not prepare for war. They prepared for understanding. Magnus wept in the quiet halls of the Pyramid of Photep. He wandered through memory, not fortification. He did not marshal his armies. He called his sons to silence, to meditation, to retreat. They did not sharpen blades. They recited poems. They did not raise walls. They opened books. They had always believed they were part of the Imperium's soul. They did not yet know they had already been exiled from its heart. As the fleet of the Space Wolves crossed the void, carried by Russ's rage and by orders none truly questioned, Prospero did not raise its shields. They still believed in reason. The winds of Prospero, once calm and contemplative, had begun to whisper portents of fracture. Within the opaline domes of Tisca, beneath the vaulted arches of its endless libraries, and between the swirling constellations of its thought lanterns, the thousand suns continued their tireless quest for hidden truths. But now, amid the vast galleries of golden script and vitrified glyph work, a slow unease settled like a dustful veil. The Council of Nicaea had delivered its verdict. The psychic arts, now branded heretical by the Emperor himself, were to be bound in silence. The edict was clear, but the soul of Magnus was torn. To obey was to betray truth. To defy was to shatter loyalty. He did not speak often in those days. The crimson-robed scholars of the cults, Corvidae, Pavoni, Athenians, and more, gathered like scattered shards of broken glass, seeking direction. But Magnus the Red, once eloquent and radiant, sat motionless upon his throne of obsidian and orrery light. His eye, the cyclopean gaze that once pierced the fabric of realms, stared now only inward. Ahriman, ever the faithful student, sought to bridge the breach forming in the brotherhood. He moved from cult to cult, from silent chamber to debate hall, invoking unity, urging calm. He spoke of the great work, of the cosmic weave they had only begun to unravel, and of the responsibility they bore not only to the Imperium, but to the deeper order of reality. But his words, though weighted with reason and reverence, could not mend the invisible fissures widening beneath the surface. Among the Pavoni, whispers began. Why should we bow to ignorance? The Raptora murmured, we are not warp-touched monsters. We are architects of fate. Even the Skolaks of the Corvidae, most cautious and reserved, now began to see patterns of doom coalescing in the tarot of glass. In secret, the flame of resentment was being fed. It was then that Magnus spoke again, not to his sons, not to the wider Imperium, but to the ether. Alone in the tower of the Cyclops, he reached out with all the power of his being, a forbidden act, a desperate one. He cast his will into the warp like a comet, seeking his father, the Emperor, not through Vox nor Curia, but through the Immaterium itself. The Astronomicon, the great beacon, flickered. Time unravelled, and the veil thinned. Magnus beheld the truth he was never meant to see, the secret project beneath the Imperial Palace, the birth of the Webway Gate, the Emperor's own silent mastery of the warp, done in secrecy, in fear, perhaps in shame. And in his seeing, he broke the gate. In that moment, the fracture was made real, not just of webway pathways, but of loyalty, of purpose, of trust. And from the edge of existence, something watched. The sorcerers of Prospero felt the tremor ripple through their souls. Books fluttered open on their own. Statues wept ichor. Familiars hissed and vanished into flame. Even the youngest acolytes, born without training in foresight, awoke from dreams of fire and judgment. Ahriman confronted his master. You saw too far, my lord. You reached too deep. The warp is not our ally. It is our reflection. And we are cracked. Magnus, though taller than any mortal man, seemed smaller now, like a dying star pulling inward before collapse. I did what I had to do, he whispered, voice barely more than wind across stone. I warned him. I warned the Emperor. I saw what was coming, but at what cost? Ahriman's voice trembled. You have doomed us all. No answer came. in the observatories of Tisca, the skies turned red. The dream that had begun in innocence, the dream of a legion of philosopher kings bringing light to the stars, had been touched by shadow. The psychic gift, once sacred, was now a curse. The path they walked, once paved in enlightenment, now led toward fire. And far away, beneath the golden throne, the emperor of mankind wept not for the damage done, but for the betrayal received. Prospero would not be forgiven, it would be purged. And so, the fractured sigil of the thousand suns began to darken, not with blood, not yet, but with destiny. For no dream, however noble, survives prophecy unscathed. The ice of Fenris cracked as the summons came. Deep within the vast mountain holes of the Vulca Fenrica, where runes burned with primal flame and sagas were etched in the bones of dead beasts, the howl of fate was heard. It did not come as a whisper or a message. It came as a command, a single edict, spoken in the High Lord's tongue, but burned with the will of the Emperor. The thousand suns have transgressed. Their world shall be punished. You, Leman Russ, shall deliver the Emperor's justice. The rune priests shivered at the words. The skyfire over Asserheim roared in anger. The Wolfen beneath the ice stirred in their crypt prisons. This was not a war. It was a culling, a reaping of a brother legion once called kin. But the Emperor's will was not to be questioned, not by mortals nor gods. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, Lord of the Rout, did not ask why. He had never trusted Magnus, not his words, not his gifts, not the silver tongue that spoke of balance and peace while sorcery danced in his veins. Russ was a creature of instinct, of brutal truth. He knew the warp's taint when he smelled it, and he had smelled it on Prospero long before the Council of Nicaea. Now the leash was removed. Within days, the Fang roared to life. The great longships of the Space Wolves, the Firefang, the Mjolnir, the Hrafnkel, rose from the black stone hangars like iron beasts shaking off sleep. Pacts were gathered, rites were spoken, and oaths were carved not in parchment, but in flesh. "We go to hunt the liars of light," said Bjorn the Fell-Handed, his claw glinting under the storm lamps. "We go to tear down the Tower of Pride." But among the wolves there were mutterings. Not all were at ease. Magnus was the son of the Emperor, one young skald whispered, his beard not yet frosted with age. Should blood be spilled for what may yet be forgiven? "Blood has already been spilled," came the answer from an older wolf priest. "You just haven't seen it yet." But the Emperor has, and his judgment is final. Even so, the bitterness of it festered. A war against a fellow, Primarch, against brothers of the Great Crusade, against those who had once stood beside them at the walls of shattered cities and the gates of demon-infested ruins. It was a war that would not bring glory, only silence. And behind Russ, ever near but never fully seen, moved a darker shadow, the Sigillite's emissary, Malkador. None called him by name, and none among the rout met his eyes. He was not of their kind. His steps did not ring upon metal, and his voice, when it came, seemed to speak directly into the soul. He said little, but one phrase, whispered to Russ in the Hall of Sagas, hung in the air like smoke. "This is not only punishment, it is protection. The warp must not devour the Imperium from within." Russ snarled, "Say what you will, old ghost. But when this is done, I will no longer call him brother." Malkador merely nodded. Perhaps he had expected no less. And so, the fleet of the Space Wolves, the Emperor's executioners, set its course through the stars, toward Prospero. As the ships passed through the tides of the warp, the Geller fields hummed with barely contained violence. Fenrisian runes pulsed along the holes, ancient protections against the touch of demons. The warriors of the rout sang war songs of old, not to celebrate, but to remember who they were before they shed kin blood. In the dark corners of the flagship, Russ sharpened his blade, not with joy, not with hatred, but with grim necessity. He remembered the laughing crimson eyes of Magnus at Ulanor, the philosophical debates they had once shared, even the rare bond they once almost had. But that bond had long since died. Perhaps it had never truly lived. And even now, beyond the veil of time and space, Magnus felt the coming storm. He awoke in the Tower of the Cyclops, sweat upon his brow. He had dreamed of wolves, not as symbols, not as omens, but as truth, a truth falling from orbit in ships of steel and fire. He called his sons to him. "The wolves are coming," he said, "and they do not come to speak." Ahriman paled. "Then this is our punishment?" "No," Magnus said. "This is our reckoning." The war had not yet begun, but the stage was set. The swords were sharpened. The blood oaths had been spoken. And from one side of the galaxy to the other, the dream that had begun on Prospero, a dream of knowledge, of unity between the flesh and the spirit, was about to be silenced beneath fang and flame. The wolves had been unleashed, and there would be no mercy. Prospero shimmered beneath twin suns, a jewel of intellect and impossible beauty, its towers catching the light like strands of thought given form. The capital, Tisca, lay sprawled upon the edge of the sea, where crystal bridges arched over still waters and floating obelisks whispered equations into the wind. It was a city not built by hands, but by minds. Minds that yearned to understand the universe, not conquer it. Here, knowledge reigned. And here, the 1,000 Suns waited, not as conquerors, nor as rebels, but as scholars and sentinels of a dream they had never expected to be punished for dreaming. The people of Prospero, those few outside the Legion, allowed to remain in Tisca, walked quietly through the city in recent days. Their skin bore the tattoos of enlightenment, their eyes gleamed with starlight, and their speech was filled with precision. But all of that light dimmed with each passing hour. For Magnus had summoned his sons from across the planet. The great temples were sealed, the vaults of arcane history locked, and the Libraria itself now pulsed with warding runes etched in fear. Even the air felt heavier. Something was coming. And though the Council of Nicaea had decreed the end of their arts, none in Tisca had truly ceased. Not entirely. Not when their leader was Magnus the Red, who had once spoken to stars and walked in dreams with beings beyond understanding. Ahriman stood atop the tower of the constellation, gazing westward. The sea shimmered, but his eyes saw deeper, through time, through probability, through the rippling fabric of what might yet be. He whispered to the wind, and the wind answered in equations. Possibilities spun like galaxies in his mind. Futures where the wolves came in peace. Futures where Magnus knelt. Futures where Prospero burned. He closed his eyes. Only one of those felt real. Inside the pyramid of Photep, the Crimson King waited. His cyclopean eye was closed, his brow furrowed not in fear but in sorrow. The skeins of fate had become as tattered as the edges of a void map. The signs were clear. They would be attacked. But Magnus had seen further still. He had seen the strands behind the attack, the hand that moved the Wolf King like a knife. The truth of the coming storm was far more terrible than the Legion suspected. I tried to warn him, Magnus whispered to himself. I reached too far. I shattered too much. A presence entered the chamber, the subtle pressure of power, the scent of burned pages and psychic oil. It was Aemon, his trusted aide and old friend. They ask for guidance, Aemon said softly. They see the wards you raise, the spells you craft behind closed doors. They know the wolves are coming, and they do not understand why we do not strike first. Magnus opened his eye. Because they are our kin, he said, even now. Even though they come with blades. To strike first is to kill what little hope remains, Aemon hesitated. And if they do not come to parley? Then, Magnus said, rising from his throne of obsidian flame, we will make this a battle that the galaxy will never forget, not for pride, not for vengeance, but so the truth is not erased. All across the city, the Legion prepared. In the vaults of Anankara, the Rubricae were awoken, the silent warriors clad in gold and scarlet, whose souls were bound to armor by arts that skirted the edge of what mortals called heresy. In the Yadis great observatory, warp scryers stared into the void, painting the paths of the oncoming fleet in glowing threads of light. The space wolves were coming fast, too fast for negotiation. Their trajectory was a blade aimed straight at Tizca's heart. In the lower districts, citizens were escorted into shielded sanctuaries beneath the temples. Cries of fear were soothed by words of binding, spells of calm whispered by psychers in hushed tones. Even in their last hours, the Prosperine believed in clarity, in discipline, in thought above fear, and high above, the sky grew dark, not with clouds, with ships. The first hulls broke from the upper atmosphere like gods descending, Fenrisian longships, covered in snarling effigies and runes of death. They came in silence, without broadcast, without demand, just flame. And then, from orbit, the first strike, orbital bombardment. Tizca shook, the ground ruptured, glass towers shattered into light and razor-edged shards. The sea boiled as it was struck with thermal lances from the sky. Hundreds died in the first moments. The city had been given no warning, no parley. The wolves had not come to speak. Magnus stood amidst the chaos, his crimson armor gleaming in the twilight of destruction. His hands moved in impossible shapes, shielding runes, temporal loops, displacement glyphs. He saved hundreds in moments, but not all. He turned to Ahriman, who had appeared through a rip in space. "Begin the rite of tolerance," he said. Ahriman's eyes widened. "That ritual is not complete." "It is now," Magnus said. "We will not fight as beasts. We will show them what it means to face knowledge unbound from every temple. Psychic fire erupted. The thousand suns rose not as an army of war, but as an army of will. Their minds unleashed, their bodies surrounded in halos of reality-bending force. They moved with perfect synchrony, each one a node in a psychic web that began to bend the very battlefield itself. The first drop pods of the rout slammed into the city's edges. Fenrisian warriors burst forth with roars, bolters barking, chain blades revving. Their runes glowed like wounds. Their eyes were filled with fury. The battle had begun. Steel met sorcery. Fire met mind. The dream of Prospero, once delicate and crystalline, now cracked beneath the weight of betrayal and blood. Rubricae stood motionless as they absorbed volleys of fire, returning death in perfectly measured bolts. Word flames scorched the ice-fanged warriors of Fenris, but they charged still, undeterred, unafraid, unstoppable. And at the city's center, Magnus wept as he fought. This was not the war he wanted. This was not justice. This was destruction. Yet even still, he held back. Even still, he refused to kill his brother. He believed even now in redemption. But far above, within the lead ship of the rout, Lehman Russ watched the battle unfold through his scrying lens. His face was stone. No triumph, no rage, only cold duty. He turned to his Skald. He resists. He shields. He still clings to the lie of restraint. "Shall we strike deeper?" the Skald asked. Russ nodded once. "Burn it all." The city of thought would not last the day. The wolves had come, and the dream that was Prospero cracked beneath their howls. They came not as diplomats, not as sons, not as brothers. They came as executioners, and the sky above Prospero wept flame. The fleet of the space wolves entered orbit with no pretense, no warning, no final parley. The skies darkened with the presence of the Vilca Fenrica's longships, their hulls bristling with macro cannons and torpedo silos. Around them coiled mechanicum vessels, cold and clinical, and in their shadow loomed something greater still, the Sisypheum, the death of reason, the moon-quiet whisper of the custodes. The edict had been signed. The council's judgment had become a spear, and it was thrust down upon the gleaming towers of Tisca with merciless precision. Prospero's defense grid activated too late. The Thousand Suns had never prepared for this. Their greatest strength had always been introspection, not war. Their weapons were knowledge, their armor understanding, but none of that stopped fire from falling. The first salvos shattered the city's outer districts. Towers of light and thought turned to ash. The great crystal spires filled with the songs of logic and arcana were reduced to molten slag. The psychic wards of the pyramid of Photep strained under the barrage. Great runes collapsed. Energy shields fractured like glass struck by the wrath of a god. Magnus did not fight back. He watched. He stood atop his great tower, a lone crimson figure gazing into the abyss of betrayal. Around him, the air rippled with the power he kept chained. The warp sang to him, screamed to him. His sons cried out, "Father, command us. Let us strike back." But Magnus shook his head. His eye, the one that remained, burned with sorrow deeper than the ocean. "This is my fault," he said. And it was. For though the Legion had been accused of sorcery, though they had been condemned for their pursuit of the warp's truth, it was Magnus who had broken the seal. He who had looked into the future and seen the betrayal at Istvan. He who had cried out to the Emperor, breaking every law to do so. He who had torn open the veil between Terra and the Sea of Souls. And he who had done it in love, misguided, desperate love. Now the price was being paid in blood. Across the city, the Thousand Suns rallied. The great cults formed ranks. The Pavoni, flesh shapers, glowing with internal suns. The Raptora, kinetic shields dancing on their arms. The Athanians, who wielded thought as blades. The Corvidae, seeing patterns amidst the ruin, struggling to alter fate. And the Pyrae, who turned rage into firestorms. Ahriman stood at the head of them, golden helm marked with the eye of the Cyclops, his heart torn between logic and fury. "Let us strike back," he said, this time not as a plea, but as a vow. And at last, Magnus spoke the words he had held within him like a poisoned heart. "Defend the city, but do not kill unless you must." The wolves did not give such grace. By the time their drop pods struck the white sands of Tisca's golden shores, the city was already half in ruin. Lehman Russ led the charge himself, axe in hand, his howling warriors beside him. Bjorn the fell-handed roared defiance as he cleaved through psychic barriers with contemptuous ease. The Wolfen were unleashed, mutated remnants of the wolves' own darkest curse, their claws rending stone and sorcerer alike. There were no battle lines. This was a massacre. And yet the Thousand Suns did not fall easily. On the marble steps of the Hall of Forgotten Glyphs, Pyre warlocks turned space wolves to ash. Along the canals of memory, the Pavoni reshaped blood and bone into jagged spears. The Raptora formed domes of force, holding entire streets against the tide. But for every wolf who fell, 5 more emerged. The custodes arrived like golden death, silent, unspeaking. They made no distinction between heretic and scholar. They moved like gods of war, and where they passed, the air grew cold with finality. Ahriman fought alongside Hathor Mat and Kalophis, brothers of rank and wisdom. Together, they tried to hold the plaza before the Observatory of Truths. They succeeded for an hour. Then the sky cracked, and the Firefang descended, and the plaza was gone. Still, the sons of Prospero refused to abandon their home, even as the towers burned, even as the dead littered the shining causeways like fallen stars, even as the wolves howled into the streets. For there was something deeper binding them to this place, not just loyalty to a Primarch, but loyalty to knowledge itself. They had studied not for power, but for understanding, to grasp the infinite, to touch the mind of the cosmos and make sense of it. And now, that dream was ending under thunder and blood. In the final hours of the siege, as the last defensive wards collapsed, Magnus descended into the heart of his library, the Athenaeum Nocturnis, the Dark Archive. There, surrounded by tomes bound in star skin and scrolls written in pre-imperial tongues, he stared into the mirrored floor, and he spoke, not aloud, but into the ether. I tried to save you, Father. I broke your laws to save your Imperium, and now I am punished for it. His voice trembled not with fear, but with grief. Around him, reality flickered. The warp listened, and something else answered. From the darkest corner of the library, where even light would not tread, a whisper came, a presence, not new, not unknown, but long ignored. Tzeentch, god of change, god of secrets, the architect of fate. Say the word, it offered, and I will save them. Magnus recoiled, but outside, his sons were dying. His dreams were burning. The great cyclopean eye of Tizca was closing, forever. And so Magnus stood, and wept, and whispered one word, yes. At that moment the warp screamed, the mirror cracked, the air ignited, and the phoenix, once bound in flesh, spread his wings of soul and fire. Magnus the Red, no longer man, no longer mere Primarch, stepped forth in wrath and sorrow, and the war for Prospero reached its terrible crescendo. The skies above Prospero wept fire. The fleet of the Vulca Fenrica, led by Leman Russ himself, descended upon the jeweled world with the fury of a god betrayed. The skies cracked with thunder as drop pods tore through the upper atmosphere, trailing flame like the arrows of vengeful spirits. The spires of Tizca, once gleaming with knowledge and the promise of peace, now trembled under the weight of an approaching doom. The 1,000 suns watched from the marble balconies of their city, eyes wide with disbelief and resolve. Some still hoped even now that parley might be offered, that brotherhood might hold. They were fools. No words were spoken when the first wave landed, no declarations of war, only the screams of steel and the thunder of bolter fire. The wolves fell upon Prospero like a tide of fury, their howls echoing through the psychic ether, drowning the quiet symphony of thought that had once defined the city of sorcerers. In the heart of Tizca, Magnus sat in stillness upon the grand dais of the pyramid of Photep. Around him, the senior magisters had gathered. Ahriman, Hathor Mat, Kalophis, Menkora, each bearing grim tidings. The flesh change is manifesting again, whispered Minkora. Too many of our brothers are turning, their minds cracking under the strain of the warp. And yet we cannot abandon the power that saved us from extinction, Ahriman replied, his voice tight. Without the warp, we would have perished long before this day. But the wolves have not come to debate, said Hathormart. They have come to destroy. Silence fell, and then Magnus spoke. Let them come. There was no anger in his voice, only a deep, unspoken sorrow. The kind that echoes from those who see their dreams collapse not in sudden violence, but in long, slow inevitability. Below, the battle tore through Tizca's outer districts. The space wolves, clad in furs and wrought iron, moved with brutal purpose. They burned libraries, smashed statues, shattered crystalline towers where psychic wards once pulsed. Against them stood the Thousand Suns, their gleaming red armor marked by glyphs and runes of protection. But knowledge was not enough. In the face of Fenrisian savagery, the precise, calculated sorcery of the Thousand Suns began to falter. Bolters answered incantations, blades met staves, and where the flesh change took hold, some of the sons of Magnus became horrors. Twisted amalgamations of man and warp, snarling beasts of claw and rage. It broke Magnus's heart. Each one that fell to mutation was a reminder of the price he had paid for the knowledge he had sought to control. The gene curse, once held at bay by his arts, now surged like a dam bursting beneath the pressure of cosmic judgment. For all his power, he had not saved them. He had only delayed the doom. Atop the battlements of the Pyramid of Photep, Magnus stood, his single eye gazing into the roiling storm that now engulfed his city. He could feel rust drawing closer, like a sword dragged through the blood of kin. They would meet. It was inevitable. It had always been inevitable. Russ, the executioner, Magnus, the transgressor. The Emperor's judgment made manifest through the fangs of the wolf. But even now, at the edge of annihilation, Magnus did not act. He stayed his hand. His might could have scoured the battlefield. Worlds had buckled under his gaze, but he refused. It was not because he feared death. It was because he still loved his father. He still hoped, deep in the shattered crystal core of his heart, that the Emperor might intervene, that he might see the mistake in this punishment, in this blind rage, that he might call off the hounds. But no voice came from Terra, no word from the master of mankind, only silence. And in that silence, Magnus made a choice. He would surrender. He sent Ahriman to the field with a psychic projection, a plea, an appeal, a final effort to stop the bloodshed. But the wolves laughed. There would be no surrender, not for sorcerers, not for heretics, not for a legion that had dared to gaze into the warp without blindfolds. Russ had come not for peace. He had come to break his brother. In the burning remnants of the great library, Ahriman knelt beside the bodies of his fallen brethren, their armor melted, their minds torn open. He had tried to reason. He had tried to offer truce, and he had been answered with flame. Tizca was falling. And still, Magnus held back. He walked through the palace alone, each step echoing through vast halls now filled with firelight and shadow. He touched the walls as he passed, as if saying farewell. The murals of terror, the stained glass depictions of ancient psychic rites, the texts written in sigils of light, all of it doomed to ash. And finally, he came to the summit of the pyramid. There Leman Russ waited. The Wolf King stood amidst the ruin, his armor scarred, his axe wet with blood. He looked up at his brother, and for a moment the war fell away. 2 Primarchs, 2 sons of the Emperor. brought to this moment not by hatred, but by fate. "Stand down, Magnus," Russ growled. "You should never have touched the warp." "You brought this on yourself." Magnus said nothing. "Is this all that remains of your pride?" Russ asked. "A broken tower and a bleeding dream?" Then, without warning, the Wolf King lunged. The battle that followed would be etched in memory and warp echo for millennia. Steel met sorcery. Blade clashed with force fields of thought and will. The sky above Prospero split with psychic lightning as two demigods fought, not just for dominance, but for the soul of the Imperium itself. Magnus fought not with hate, but sorrow. Each blow was weighted with reluctance. He still loved Russ. He still loved the Emperor. But love could not stop the fang. Russ struck low, shattering Magnus's ribs. He struck high, carving through shoulder and arm. And finally, with a roar like the death of an old god, Leman Russ lifted his brother above him and brought him down upon his knee. The sound was heard across the warp, a crack, a cry, a breaking. Magnus shattered, not just in bone but in spirit. The glass of his soul, once crystalline and complex, cracked into 1,000 shards. He vanished, his broken form dissolving into light, into thought, into something else. The 1,000 sons, seeing their father fall, faltered. They screamed, they wept, they died, and Tisca, the city of light, fell into silence. But in the warp something stirred. Magnus, broken but not destroyed, slipped between the cracks of reality. His body was undone, but his will, his soul, burned brighter than ever. And in that burning, he saw the lie of the Emperor's promise. He saw that hope would never be granted. He saw that forgiveness would never come. And so he made a new pact, with the warp, with the thing behind the mirror, with the being whose eye had always watched. Tzinch, change. And the dream of Prospero, once golden and pure, curdled into vengeance. The fall was complete, but the war had only begun. Ask ChatGPT. Beneath the amber-red skies of Prospero, as the dust of crumbling knowledge still drifted through the sacred windways of Tisca, Magnus the Red stood alone in the inner sanctum of the pyramid of Photep. Not even his sons dared enter, for they sensed the shadow curling around his presence, something deeper than sorrow, older than rage. He stood before the great orrery, a vast astral mechanism that mirrored the stars themselves, a monument of the mind built with impossible craft, suspended in defiance of gravity by sheer psychic will. And now it was unraveling. The stars it mapped were trembling. Something was coming. Something he had once called brother, the wolf. The Imperium had not listened to words. Nicaea had silenced reason. The Emperor had turned his back. But perhaps the warp still listened. Perhaps, in the weave between what was and what might be, salvation still whispered. Magnus stretched out his hand. Light shimmered across the globe of the orrery, and a single thread of fate, so small, so fragile, glowed crimson. He touched it, and pain flared through his mind like white fire, a future, a path, a scream. What he saw made him reel back in horror. The wolves descending, Tisca burning, the scarab occult broken, Ahriman shattered, and his own voice echoing through the flames. I warned him. No, Magnus breathed. This cannot be the only path. His eye closed. The psychic storm above the world coiled tighter. The sea boiled around the golden spires. And within the tower of the Cyclops, Magnus turned once more to forbidden art. He would send a message. He would break every law. He would tear through the fabric of reality itself to speak to the Emperor one last time. He gathered the 9, the greatest of his sons, Ahriman, Phocis Takar, Kalophis, Hathormat, and the others, arrayed in a circle around him. Their armor glowed with wards. Their minds were sharpened to razors. They did not question, though they felt the danger. "We are going to pierce the veil," Magnus said, voice reverent, "not with ships, not with machines, but with will." Ahriman's face was unreadable beneath his golden helm. "To Terra." "To the Emperor," Magnus answered, directly, in thought. In essence, there was silence. Even the wind seemed to still. "That is forbidden," muttered Kalophis. "It is necessary," said Magnus. "He must know. Before Russ comes, before the blood spills," Ahriman stepped forward. "And if he turns from you again." Magnus looked up, and in his single eye was a depth of loneliness that stretched wider than the eye of terror itself. "Then let him see me fall," he said, "but let him know why." So began the casting. They stood upon a sigil traced in blood and ash, woven from the memories of fallen psychers and burned parchment from the hidden vaults of Kronos. Their voices rose, not in chant, but in thought. A chorus of psychic vibration, a perfect harmony of mind and soul. The pyramid trembled. The stars above flickered, and Magnus, brilliant, terrible Magnus, took the final step. He reached through the warp, not as a sorcerer, but as a son, a plea, not a spell. "Father, hear me." The Astronomicon burned bright. In the heart of terror, the Emperor felt the echo. For the first time in years, he turned his gaze toward Prospero. And in that moment, the warp screamed. Something ancient and watching stirred, something that had been waiting for just such a tear. For Magnus had not just opened a door, he had ripped a hole. And through that hole something immense reached back. It was not the Emperor who answered, it was a god. The mind of Tzeentch, the changer of ways, coiled into the psychic breach like a serpent through a wound. Not a voice, but a million, laughing, whispering, lying, promising. Did you think yourself untouched? Did you think power came without price? Magnus staggered, blood pouring from his eye. His sons cried out, but the ritual could not be broken. Not now. Not with the warp feeding on them like a firestorm. He saw glimpses, himself, crowned in golden fire, his sons turned to dust, his father weeping, the galaxy splitting. And then nothing. The spell collapsed, the pyramid cracked, and far across the stars, the psychic scream reached terror in full, shattering the chambers of the sigillite, sending the custodians to their knees. In the deepest vault of the imperial palace, the Emperor turned to Malcador and whispered a single word. "Prospero." The order was given. What had been judgment now became execution. The wolves were unleashed with no restraint, no quarter. And Magnus, he fell to his knees amid the wreckage of the chamber. His sons lay unconscious. Ahriman knelt beside him, shaking, his soul scorched by the vision. "You saw him?" Ahriman asked. Magnus didn't answer. He stared at his hands. They trembled, not from fear, but from realization. "I broke everything," he said softly. "The Emperor, he knows now, but so does something else, and it is watching us." From the shattered walls of the pyramid, one could now see the stars had shifted. The warp above Prospero no longer shimmered with dreams. It howled, and far beyond, the engines of the Vulca Fenrica screamed through the tides of the immaterium, ever closer. The spell had been cast. The stars would burn, and fate, cruel, blind, eternal, was already in motion. It began with a howl, not of mortal voice, nor of wind, but of something more primal, something ancient, bred in the icy dark of Fenris, sharpened by hatred, and loosed upon the stars by a father's command. The Vulca Fenrica had come. From the void, the space wolves descended. The 13th Legion, the Emperor's executioners, not as emissaries, not as warriors of peace, but as beasts on the hunt, fangs bared, guided by Russ himself, the Wolf King of Fenris. Their fleet tore through the warp like thunder through silence. The arcane storms that had protected Prospero for so long were peeled back, burned away by the focused will of the rune priests and the fury of the wolves. It was not an invasion. It was an extinction. On Prospero, the skies darkened. The swirling aurora above Tizca turned from light to flame. The pyramid of Photep, wounded by Magnus's great ritual, trembled as if sensing the reckoning approaching. In the tower of the Cyclops, Ahriman stood motionless, his gaze turned skyward. Beside him the others gathered. Phocis Takar, the flame-handed destroyer. Kalophis, the philosopher mystic. Balek Utizar, the mute telepath. And Hathor Mat, reader of forgotten signs. All had felt it, all knew. The wolves were coming. "My lord," Phocis asked, his tone still defiant. Ahriman shook his head. "Not yet. Magnus will speak." And Magnus did. Hours later, as the void above began to shimmer with the presence of battle barges and dropships, he emerged from the inner sanctum. His red armor was scorched, cracked. His eye burned with new light, and yet he seemed older, like something vital within him had been spent. He spoke not as a Primarch, but as a father. "The Emperor has sent Russ," he said quietly, "not to speak, not to judge, to destroy." There was silence. Phocis Takar's fist flared with flame. "Then we fight," Kalophis murmured. "There is no victory in this." "There is only meaning," Ahriman added. "And how we face..." Our N. Magnus looked at them all. His sons, his creations, his chosen. He remembered crafting each one, breathing thought into flesh, will into soul. He remembered their triumphs, their heresies, their questions. And now he would remember their deaths. "We do not fight to survive," he said. "We fight so that what we stood for, knowledge, understanding, the power of mind, is not forgotten." Outside, the first drop pods fell. The wolves had begun their assault. The sky turned to fire. The gleaming spires of Tizca, once radiant with psychic energy, were shattered by orbital bombardments. Libraries that had stood for centuries were turned to glass in seconds. Statues of forgotten sages crumbled beneath the boots of advancing wolves. And still, the Thousand Suns resisted. From every tower, every street, the psychically gifted warriors of Prospero struck back, not with brute force, but with the elegance of the mind. Firestorms coiled into the sky. Time was fractured and rewoven. Flesh became thought, and thought became weapons. But the wolves knew no fear, and they knew no hesitation. Led by their rune priests, those shamans of Fenris who used the same warp they scorned, they tore through the defenders with barbaric grace. They were not untouched by sorcery. They simply hated it less than they hated the arrogance of Prospero. In the Grand Library, once home to more knowledge than any place outside Terra, the shelves burned. Word-bane blades cut down robed scholars. Telekinetic barriers shattered under the hammering fists of Fenrisian dreadnoughts. And amidst it all, the Legion fought its own heartbreak. There were those among the Thousand Suns who begged to surrender, who asked for parley, who still believed in the dream of unity, but no answer came. Only claws, only war. Ahriman led a counterattack near the Gate of Moons, where a pack of wolves had broken through the psychic wards. There, he unleashed his full power, tearing apart time itself in brief flashes, forcing the wolves to relive their deaths before they struck. Yet still they came, again, again. "They cannot be stopped," hissed Balek Utizar, blood dripping from his eyes. We are undone. Ahriman looked to the horizon, where the tallest spire of the city, Magnus's own tower, still stood. No, he whispered, not undone. Not yet high above, on the burning bridge of his flagship, Leman Russ watched the fires of Prospero with unreadable eyes. His face was still, carved from frost and battle. He held the spear of the Emperor in one hand, and in the other, the burden of a broken brotherhood. Magnus had been his kin, his comrade, once. Now he was the enemy, and yet deep within the Wolf King, something struggled. Not pity, not doubt, but memory of a time when the Primarchs stood together, before Nicaea, before the lies. He turned to Bjorn, his most loyal warrior. Prepare the strike, Russ said. We end this. And so, the final blow was set in motion. The wolves would descend upon the pyramid of Photep. They would drag Magnus from the ashes, and the dream of Prospero would shatter forever. Below, amidst the ash and ruin, the 1,000 sons prepared for their last stand. There would be no reinforcements, no hope, but there would be memory. And in memory, perhaps, there would be justice. The pyramid of Photep burned like a dying star. Its radiant spires, once the heart of Tizca's glory, bled molten glass and collapsed crystal. Inside silence fell, broken only by the hum of shattered wards and the slow grinding of stone against stone. It was here, at the apex of Prospero's sacred geometry, that Magnus the Red withdrew, not to flee, but to decide. The air within the great sanctum was thick with sorrow. The wards etched into every inch of the pyramid, sigils older than the Imperium, designed to shield against the warp, the mind, and death itself, flickered with instability. The psychic foundation of Prospero trembled beneath the pressure of war. The walls whispered. The warp listened. Magnus stood at the center of a great circle etched into the floor, a scrying mirror, a lens into futures fractured by fate. His cloak of crimson and gold was torn at the hem. His armor, once a flawless carapace of intellect and elegance, was cracked and smoldering, fractured by the same energy that had splintered his own soul. His eye, the single eye that had seen too much, wept light. He had tried to warn the Emperor, tried to obey, tried to disobey, tried to save. Now all that remained was loss. Behind him, Ahriman entered. His steps were slow, reverent, burdened. Blood still dried along his gauntlets, and his mind echoed with the deaths of 1,000 brothers. His gaze, ever piercing, softened for the first time in years. "My lord," he said, and bowed his head. Magnus did not turn. "How many remain?" Ahriman hesitated. "Perhaps 10,000, perhaps less." Magnus nodded once. "Then it is ending." Outside, the wolves of Fenris closed in. The pyramid was the final bastion of the 1,000 suns. All else was ash and memory. The city of light had become a mausoleum of fire. "You were right, Arzek," Magnus said, finally facing his son. "We should have never trusted the throne." Ahriman clenched his fists. "We still have time. We can open a gate, flee into the warp, to the edges of the eye, regroup, survive Magnus. Look to the stars, or rather, to the memory of stars, seen through the dome of the shattered roof. To what end?" he asked. "To be hunted? To become the very monsters they claim us to be?" "They already call us monsters," Ahriman said bitterly. "Let them. Better to be a monster with will than a martyr with none." Magnus almost smiled. He looked into the center of the chamber, where the great mirror circle shimmered. Visions danced across its surface, timelines that never were, futures that would never be. One showed him kneeling at the foot of the Emperor, forgiven. Another showed him dead, and the galaxy aflame. One showed Prospero standing still, untouched by fire, untouched by fate. And one showed him broken, a god in chains, watching forever as his people wept. He looked away. Below the pyramid, Phocis Takar and Calaphis led the last phalanx of defenders. The wolves came in packs now, howling through shattered halls, leaping over broken statues of saints and philosophers. Fenrisian blades met psychic flame. Flesh was torn, minds were broken. And above it all, the rune priest chanted, their barbaric rites weaving counter-hexes that splintered the air. One by one, the defenders fell, and yet the pyramid held, until Russ arrived. The Wolf King came not in stealth nor haste. He strode through the gates with a company of his most savage, Bjorn, Bearclaw, Skarvald, Harek. Not a word spoken, not a breath wasted. The walls themselves groaned as he passed, repelled by the presence of the Allfather's wrath, made flesh. Magnus turned once more to Ahriman. Go. My lord. No. I must meet him alone. Ahriman hesitated. Then he bowed, lower than ever before. I will remember you, father. And I, you. Magnus ascended the final stair to the apex chamber, a place where silence was worshipped and the warp was still. It was there, beneath a great obsidian dome, that Leman Russ found him. The brothers stood across from one another, light and shadow dancing between them. No words, no apologies, no understanding, only pain. Russ raised the spear of the Emperor. Magnus raised nothing. He stood bare, empty-handed, red hair drifting like flame in the air. You were always the hammer, Magnus said, but he needed a scalpel. Russ's lip curled. He needed a son who obeyed. I did, Magnus whispered, until he abandoned us. Then came war. Russ lunged, the spear flashing like thunder through the chamber. Magnus moved with the elegance of a mind trained beyond mortality, teleporting inches ahead, warping time, blinding Russ with a storm of memory. But the Wolf King was undeterred. Blow after blow, the brothers clashed. The dome cracked. Light bled from the floor. The warp howled around them. Magnus struck with will, not fist, bending space, creating illusions, resurrecting 100 versions of himself. Russ tore through them all. He fought with fury and with grief, with betrayal burning in every strike. And then, the final blow. The spear of the Emperor pierced Magnus's side. The red giant staggered, choking on silence. His essence shivered, not with death, but with transformation. His flesh became light. His body began to crumble. I see it now, he gasped, staring at Russ. He feared me, because I saw too far. Russ's eyes softened for the briefest instant. I was never your enemy, brother. Magnus smiled, a last defiant light flickering in his eye. No, but you became his. With that, he shattered. Light exploded across the chamber. The warp screamed. The pyramid of Photep cracked from its summit to its base. And Magnus the Red, Primarch of the 15th Legion, Sorcerer King of Prospero, vanished from reality. A fragment of his soul escaped. A fragment remained, and the echo of his final cry, a cry of loss, of truth, of betrayal, echoed through the burning ruins. Russ stood alone in the rubble, the spear dim in his hands. Victory had come, but no one felt it. Outside, the sky fell silent. The wolves began to retreat. The ashes of Prospero blew across the sea. Ahriman, watching from the broken base of the city, fell to his knees. The age of reason had died, and in its place, the age of vengeance was born. In the quiet before destruction, Prospero breathed one last sigh. The skies were clear. The spires shimmered with crimson gold reflection. The oceans lapped gently at the obsidian shores, and the great libraries of Tisca remained open, welcoming pilgrims and scholars alike, unaware, or perhaps willfully blind, to the dread that loomed beyond the veil of the stars. Within the pyramid of Photep, Magnus stood in solitude, gazing into the ether. He had been silent for hours, perhaps days, unmoving upon the basalt dais, one eye closed in meditation, the other glowing faintly with warp light. Around him, the psychic wind stirred scrolls, tomes, and shattered remnants of prophecy. He was not seeking the present, he was searching the past. Fragments of his earlier vision, that fateful rending moment when he had screamed through the web of space to warn his father, returned to him like a blade reversed. He saw again the Emperor, cloaked in light, seated upon his golden throne, and the moment Magnus shattered the psychic gates of terror in his desperation. He had meant to protect, but in doing so, he had wounded the very fabric of the Emperor's design. The arcane web of the secret project, the golden webway gate, had cracked. Demons had spilled into realms once safe. The palace, once untouched by the warp's hand, had been breached, and for that he knew retribution would come. In the shadowed libraries below the pyramid, Ahriman wandered through scroll vaults lined with crystalline shelves. Each step he took echoed a growing sense of dread. He ran his fingers along runes that once whispered secrets freely, but now only hummed with unease. The scholars no longer read. The acolytes no longer debated. Even the raptors who nested in the glass towers above had flown into the upper air, abandoning the city to its fate. And in the streets of Tizca, the people waited. The psychically attuned among them felt it most keenly, the growing weight in the atmosphere, like a storm behind glass, held at bay by something unnatural and brittle. Civilians looked skyward more often. Mothers held their children closer. Merchants no longer haggled with full voice. Even the wind had begun to carry whispers, words without speakers. The city of light had grown still. Some in the legion urged for action. "Let us meet them in the void," said Phocis Takar, his armor already aglow with warp fire. "We are no cornered beasts." "Nor are we conquerors," Aemon countered, his voice cold beneath his ornate helm. "They are our brothers. What comes is not a war of ambition. It is an execution." "Then let us not die on our knees," muttered Caliphis, but Magnus forbade any assault. "No ship shall rise," he decreed. "No blade shall be drawn before the first stone of Tizca is struck. Let history know who held to wisdom." He did not explain further. He could not, for in the silence of his soul, Magnus had already seen it, seen the battle play out in fire and ruin, and he saw something more terrible still, that any resistance would only justify the wrath to come. He had to show restraint. He had to prove that it was not the sons of Prospero who thirsted for war. Ahriman alone began to understand the deeper truth. In private, he confronted his Primarch beneath the astral oculus, the eye-shaped observatory that mapped the stars in radiant silver. "You knew they would come," Ahriman said quietly. "You saw it long before Nicaea." "I did," Magnus replied, "and you let it unfold." "There was no path that did not lead here," Magnus whispered, sorrow thick in his voice. "I looked through 1,000 futures. Each one led to flame. If I fought, it ended in ruin. If I fled, they pursued. If I submitted, I died." Ahriman was silent for a long time. "You are the most powerful psyker in existence," he said finally. "You could crush them with a thought. But you choose." Nothing Magnus turned his single eye on his son. "I choose not to become the very thing they already believe I am." It was not cowardice. It was defiance of another kind. the defiance of self-control in the face of provocation, a desperate attempt to retain even a shred of moral clarity in a galaxy that had none. But outside Prospero, in the dark between worlds, the wolves howled. Their fleet had arrived. The skies above the planet shimmered as reality rippled in response to their mass. Thousands of vessels, gunships shaped like beasts of prey, drop pods slung in massive racks, ready to fall like meteoric judgment. The wolves came not alone. They brought with them the custodes, golden armored avatars of the Emperor's will, and the Sisters of Silence, whose very presence choked the air of psychic power. It was not an army, it was a verdict. Within the Rune Fang, Leman Russ stood with arms crossed, staring at the world below. "Do they not raise shields?" he asked. "No, my lord," came the reply. "Their skies remain open." Russ grunted. "He dares to shame me with passivity. Does he think I will not strike a defenseless foe?" No one answered, and in that silence, Russ turned away from the viewport. "Prepare the attack." Thus the fate of Prospero hung by a final breath. A world of thought, a city of enlightenment, a legion that had walked the border of the divine, seeking harmony between man and the immaterial. It now stood unshielded before the most savage executioners in the galaxy. And all that remained was silence. But even silence has a heartbeat, and soon it would be drowned in fire. It began not with a declaration, nor with a broadcast, nor even the howl of wolves. It began with the scream of metal. From the black belly of the sky, the first drop pods fell. Thousands of them. Each one a meteor wrapped in thunder, trailing fire like burning tears through Prospero's sapphire heavens. They came down like judgment cast from the hand of a god, furious, deliberate, undeniable. The people of Tisca looked up, and then the world shook. The first impacts shattered plaza tiles older than the Imperium itself. Great fountains of crystal dust rose into the air. Glass towers fractured. Statues of forgotten philosophers were blasted into sand. The sound of impact was like the drumbeat of doom, rhythmic, inescapable, final. The burning of Prospero had begun. From the ruptured pods emerged the wolves. The 6th Legion, clad in grey that was almost blue, moved with fury and precision. They howled as they struck, blades drawn, bolters roaring like thunderclaps. Their helms bore the visages of beasts. Their chainblades wept with fire. These were no measured warriors. They were executioners unleashed. And yet, for long minutes, there was no reply. The 1,000 Suns stood in their city, unarmed. Civilians fled in terror. Scholars tried to shield ancient vaults with wards of binding. Librarians and warrior scribes raised hands in pleading gestures, shouting in disbelief, "We are loyal." The wolves did not listen. On the steps of the great archive, a pack of space wolves cornered an elderly scholar named Tahur, who had not lifted a weapon in 4 centuries. He raised a psychic ward, barely able to hold it with shaking hands. A single bolt round punched through it, and through him. He collapsed silently, blood staining the scrolls at his feet. On the skybridge of lanterns, Sister Silence detachments advanced, null fields rippling in their wake. Psychers they passed fell to their knees, robbed of breath, their connection to the warp severed like an umbilical cord torn from the womb. And then, finally, the silence broke. It was Phocis Takar who defied orders first. From the flaming wreckage of the Hall of Attainment, he rose in psychic fury. Fire coiled from his armor. His eyes burned like twin stars. With a gesture, he turned a dozen wolves into cinders. In that instant, the rubric was cast aside. All across Tisca, 1,000 Suns, who had knelt in patience, now stood, Armor plates snapped closed. Warp-born flames danced across their hands. Dust became iron. Thought became wrath. The Legion rose, and Prospero became a battlefield. From the towers of the Athenaeum, bolts of mind fire rained down on the wolves' advance. Rubricae, those silent, dust-filled warriors of psychic wrath, marched in perfect order, unleashing salvos that melted ceramite. Dreadnoughts cloaked in runes strode from stasis vaults to rejoin a war they had never been meant to see. At the center of it all, Ahriman stood, directing the counter-strike like a conductor amidst a storm. His voice echoed through the minds of every battle brother. Hold the gates. Fall back to the spiral promenade. Let them come. Let them burn. But the wolves were not alone. From orbit descended the custodes, 10-foot-tall giants in auramite, wielding spears of light and shields that shimmered with solar energy. Each was a demigod, forged in the Emperor's image, and they made even the wolves seem like mad beasts by comparison. Where a custodian strode, reality bent, wards shattered, sorcerers fell with their throats crushed by invisible hands, or were bisected by weapons that had no names in mortal tongues. And beside them came the sisters, silent, unflinching, unstoppable. With them the warp recoiled. Even the most potent psychers among the 1,000 suns could barely summon flame in their presence. The fabric of their very souls became brittle, withered by the null void aura the sisters carried like a poison. It was not a battle. It was a dismantling. Above it all, the pyramid of Photep blazed like a beacon. Its wards flared under orbital bombardment. Shields woven from warp mat trembled as lance fire from the fleet raked across its flanks. One by one, the outer wards failed, and Magnus still did not move. Within the central chamber of the pyramid, he stood motionless, arms folded, one eye closed, his soul stretched between past and future. He watched the slaughter of his sons. He felt every death like a cut across his mind. But he did not raise his hand. He would not meet Russ in anger. He had sworn to his father that he would not raise arms again. But even oaths have their limits. When the first custodian blade pierced Aemon's heart, his oldest friend, his trusted confidant, Magnus screamed. The pyramid shattered. With a thunderclap heard across the entire city, the wards collapsed and the central spire exploded outward in a flare of impossible light. Every eye turned upward as a shadow rose from within, wreathed in warp fire and sorrow. Magnus had entered the battle. His stride cracked the ground. His gaze boiled air. With a single thought, he melted a land raider into slag. With a gesture, he halted a custodian mid-leap, snapping the warrior into ash with a word of power that had no translation. He did not fight like a warrior. He fought like a god. To the 1,000 suns, his arrival was salvation. To the wolves, it was terror. And to the custodes, it was proof. The Sorcerer King had indeed become the monster they were sent to destroy. And so the final act began. As fire spread through the streets of Tisca, and the seas boiled along the coast, and the towers fell in, flame and glass, two Primarchs approached each other at last. Layman Russ, Lord of Winter and War, emerged from the wreckage of the Northern Causeway, his frost-cloaked armor steaming with blood, his great axe Mjolnir gripped tight. Across from him, Magnus advanced with robe scorched and aura blazing. Neither spoke. Not yet. The city around them burned, and in that silence between titans, the galaxy held its breath. Tisca burned, not with flame alone, but with the final fury of betrayed dreams. The last echoes of the extermination still lingered in the irradiated winds. The howl of falling warships, the roar of bolter fire, the psychic screams of those torn apart in both mind and body. All that remained now were cinders, silence, and the sorcerous ash of a city once known as the jewel of mankind's enlightened future. The sons of Magnus were gone. Some lay entombed beneath collapsed spires and vaporized sanctuaries. Others had been slain in open defiance, refusing to yield to the wolves of Russ, but many had fled, spirited away in the final act of Magnus's fragmented power, flung across the stars, scattered like stardust in a tempest. Survivors, yes, but no longer whole. The rubric had not yet come. That tragic incantation, the great gamble of Ahriman, would unfold in another age. For now, what remained was the aftermath: scorched marble, shattered obelisks, and the quiet of a world with no one left to dream. Magnus was gone too. None knew precisely where. Some whispered he had been slain, others that he had ascended. The truth was stranger still. His broken body, sundered by Leman Russ in their final duel, had been cast into the warp itself, cradled in the tides of the immaterium. And there, in the embrace of realms beyond reason, the Red Sorcerer made a choice that would damn him forever. He accepted the offer. The architect of fate, Tzeentch, ever watchful, ever hungry, enfolded Magnus in 1,000 wings of trickery and change. And Magnus, grieving, furious, and shattered, gave in. He who had once defied the ruinous powers for the sake of humanity now became one of them. A demon Primarch was born. In the Eye of Terror, a new tower rose, spiraled, impossible, half real and half nightmare. The planet of the sorcerers became the new cradle of the 1,000 suns. And there, amid shifting skies and maddening geometries, the sons of Prospero began anew, no longer guided by the Emperor, no longer bound by imperial law. They were now the chosen of change, wielders of unfathomable arcana, and bearers of a wound that would never close. Ahriman stood at the threshold of this new age. He alone remembered all that was lost. He alone still dared to speak of reason, of purpose. He saw the mutation spreading through his brothers, the flesh change returning, accelerated by their descent into the warp. He foresaw the disintegration of their souls, their minds, their very forms. And in this moment of stillness, before the heresies of the Horus conflict unfolded, he vowed to act. The rubric would come. But for now, Prospero, the dream of Prospero, was dead. In its place stood only legend and scar. And so, the tale of the dream that died on Prospero came to a close. Not with triumph, not with redemption, but with the silence that follows fire. A silence filled not with peace, but with the slow, eternal echo of everything that could have been, and never would be again.